Today we have a special guest with us, James Addison. So James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So Bruce, I also want to say good morning to you and have you share a little bit of your thoughts, and then I'll bring us into the topic and the matter that we're discussing today.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their continued support and listening to the podcast. The feedback that we're getting is exactly what Rachel and I envisioned in 2017 when we started the podcast. We wanted to do a show that was, a genuine show that talked about all viewpoints of a person's personal economy and how it fit into the world economy. And then we wanted to educate you to a point where you became your best financial advisor. Because, and as Dr. Otteson, through my research has talked about, is that it's impossible to have the all-knowing person, the one person that can figure things out for everybody, because they do not know your preferences and your emotional connection to money. And that's what we're trying to teach here, is that, to actually have a economic system where you can just plug in variables and come out with the right answer, just cannot exist, because the variables include emotional aspects of a person, and not to mention the constant changing economy. And if I can, I'm just going to take another 30 seconds to talk about one of the things in financial advising that I am in is we call safe rates of return. And safe rates of return used to be espoused at 4% until the bond market took a fall, and then they dropped it all the way down to 2.6% for a safe rate of return. And now it's actually come back up to closer to 3.6 or 3.8%. And I find it very interesting that how can you say at any time in your economic time period that it's a safe rate of return if you're able to change the variable of what is safe? And so that allows you then to be educated to understand what words are even meaning. And so to have a philosopher on that focuses on economics, I think people should stay tuned to the very end of this episode, because they're going to get information about life and about economic situations. So I'm really excited to share Dr. Otteson's viewpoints on this.
Excellent. Well, let's just give a brief overlook at what we're talking about today, and then I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into your bio, and then we're going to open up the conversation. So James Addison is the John T. Ryan Professor of Business Ethics at the University of Notre Dame, and he's the author of 7 Deadly Economic Sins, Obstacles to Prosperity and Happiness Every Citizen Should Know. So you've probably heard of the 7 deadly sins, which are pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. But he says that each of those is a natural human weakness that impedes happiness. But in addition to those vices, however, there are economic sins as well. It's interesting that you say economic sins. We're not just saying things we should avoid. They're sins. They're really bad. And they too wreak havoc on our lives and in society. They can seem intuitively compelling, yet lead to waste, loss, and foregone prosperity. So in his thoughtful and compelling book, which James Addison then tells the story of these 7 central economic fallacies, he explains why they're fallacies and why believing in them leads to mistakes and loss, and how exorcising them from our thinking can help us avoid costly errors and enable us to live in peace and prosperity. There's so much packed into that we're going to yes, unravel throughout this conversation today. That's actually from the back of your book. So today on this podcast, we're going to discuss what economists agree about. Now, many have disagreeing and varying opinions, but what they all do agree on, why wealth creation is positive sum, not zero sum, and how market economies have enabled more prosperity than any other system of economics. And also why business can be moral and honorable. A lot of themes that you've probably heard on this show before that we're going to unpack from a different perspective. So if you want a conversation about economics and philosophy and how nations prosper, this is the conversation you want to listen in today. So I'm going to give a snapshot of your bio, and then we're going to hear more from you about your background, and then dive into what the book is all about. So
great.
So you earned your bachelor's degree, Bachelor of Arts degree from the program of liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame in 1990. And then James Addison's sophomore year was spent abroad studying at the Universität Innsbruck in Innsbruck, Austria. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly.
You did, yeah.
Oh, nice. And then after completing his undergraduate degree, he attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He earned an MA in philosophy in 1992 and joined the philosophy department at the University of Chicago, receiving a PhD in 1997. Then he graduated from Chicago, took a position in the philosophy department at the University of Alabama, and then he began as an assistant professor, received tenure, and rose to become the department chair. In 2007, he accepted a position as joint professor of philosophy and economics and director of the honors program at Yeshiva University in New York City, New York. In 2013, he moved to Wake Forest University, and in 2020, he's returned to his alma mater and joined the faculty at the University of Notre Dame. So at Notre Dame, we mentioned that he's the John T. Ryan Jr. Professor of Business Ethics, the Rex and Alice A. Martin Faculty Director, and the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership and Faculty Director of the Business Honors Program. So I'm going to leave it there, except I do want to share from the end here that you lecture widely on Adam Smith, classical liberalism, political economy, business ethics, and related issues, including the Fund for American Studies, the Adam Smith Society, the Acton Institute, the Fraser Institute, and the Tikva Fund. So just a fascinating swath through university and a lot of philosophy that led you into economics. So can we hear from you and your perspective about that background that led you to deciding that economics was something fascinating to you?
I'm happy to. That was quite a thorough introduction and review. So thank you very much, Rachel. You're right. My own academic journey has been somewhat unusual. And for a philosophy PhD to be teaching in a business school, that's a very unusual thing. But really, I wish I could say that it was because of a grand design or a grand plan, but it was really a series of accidents. I was a liberal studies major. So the program of liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame is sometimes called its Great Books program. That's its Great Books major. I had gone into college thinking I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. So I didn't know much about what college was about. And I thought that if you went to college, I mean, this was back in the day, as you noted, but I thought if you went to college, you should either become a medical doctor or a lawyer. I thought those were the two things you became. And so I was going to be a medical doctor. And I just happened to take a course that I was required to take that was taught by a classics professor. And we read things like Homer's Iliad, which I had never heard of and didn't know anything about, never read it. And I was completely transfixed by that book. I absolutely loved it. But anyway, it led me into the Great Books program at Notre Dame. When I was in graduate school, in particular at the University of Chicago, one of my philosophical heroes was David Hume. And I thought, well, I want to write my dissertation on something like the moral theory, David Hume's moral theory. He was the great 18th century Scottish philosopher, one of the leading lights of what we now call the Scottish Enlightenment. But there were so many people writing on Hume at the time that I was sort of casting about, trying to find some new angle, something that I could write on. And I discovered, to my surprise, that he had been personal friends with somebody named Adam Smith. And so they were both Scotsmen. They were both leaders of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. But I had heard of Adam Smith, and even as an undergraduate, I had read a little bit from his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, and I didn't really remember much, to be honest. I remember the phrase "invisible hand." I didn't really remember much else. But I thought I would look into Smith a little bit more because I thought, any friend of Hume's is a friend of mine. And I discovered that Smith wrote this other book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I had never heard of. That was actually his first book, came out in 1759. So I decided on a lark to read that. And I read it, and I thought, wow, this book is amazing. I was completely blown away with the insights and the depth of analysis of that book. And so I rushed to the library. This is a time when people used to go to libraries and read books. I rushed to the library to see what other philosophers had said about Adam Smith, and it turned out almost nothing. Philosophers hadn't really written anything about Adam Smith. The only people who were writing about Adam Smith were economists who were writing about the Wealth of Nations. With all due respect to economists, many of whom are my friends, they're not always the best scholars. And so a lot of what they wrote about Adam Smith wasn't really very good, to be honest. They were sort of using or appropriating him for their own purposes. So I decided to write my dissertation on Adam Smith's moral theory, and that's what I ended up doing. But that kind of launched, this was a couple of accidents that led me to that. And that just got me interested in, once I was studying the moral theory of Smith, that got me interested in the political economy, or what we now would recognize or call economics, that Smith himself worked on, but that others worked on in the 18th century, which got me a little interested in the history of economic thought. So I began to study that through the 19th century into the 20th century. I started teaching courses in the history of economic thought. And eventually I was asked, and this brings us a little bit closer to this book, I was asked to teach a business ethics course, which I had never taught before. And I did a little bit of looking around at, what other people taught in business ethics courses. And I thought, discovered a couple of things. One of them is that there was no clear consensus, it didn't seem to me anyway, no clear consensus about what a business ethics course should actually be, or what it should accomplish, or what it should do. All kinds of different methodologies, all kinds of different readings. Some of them were just sort of a series of a murderer's row of bad actors. You would just look at a lot of bad things that happened in business. We'd look at Enron and say, oh, weren't those guys terrible? Yeah, they were terrible. Then we look at Bernie Madoff. Wasn't he terrible? Oh, yeah, he was terrible. And you go to a series of them. Maybe, next semester we'll talk about Sam Bankman-Fried or something, and say, oh, wasn't he terrible? Yeah, that was terrible. But I thought it might be more interesting and maybe more productive if, instead of just looking at all the ways that business could go wrong, instead turning it around a little bit and asking, well, is there some kind of moral purpose that a life in business could actually serve? If you wanted to be a virtuous person, and you wanted to integrate virtue into all aspects of your life, including your professional life, what would that look like? Could you be a fully virtuous person and at the same time fully engaged in business in a market economy? And that really has led to a lot of the stuff that I've been teaching and writing about, including this book, Seven Deadly Economic Sins. So that's a little bit of my journey, maybe a little bit more than you wanted to know, but that gives you an idea of how I ended up where I am now.
That's fascinating, and definitely not more than we wanted to know. I love that. I love the wandering path that looks very random, maybe from the beginning, but looking backwards, it always makes sense, right? I think
that's right.
Who said that? Steve Jobs. The dots all connect looking backwards. And it's so fascinating that you followed this path and that philosophy led you into economics, because I think a very thoughtful study of economics is necessary. And then you're asking these questions about, can we be moral in business? I love that you were challenging the status quo, which almost didn't even seem to exist in business economics, of just studying negative problems and instead saying, how can we make this right? And so why don't you just give us a quick overview of what your book is about and kind of why you wrote this book and who it's for?
Sure. So it's really written for people, so for an intelligent, educated audience who are not economists. So, for people who are interested maybe in economic matters, or interested to know how the principles of economic reasoning might apply to decisions they might make either in their personal lives or when they're evaluating, say, candidates for office or proposed policies. But themselves they didn't major in economics. They haven't studied the economics literature. So that's really the audience for the book. That's, and that's a big audience. Almost everybody has opinions about economic matters. And that's one of the curious things about, maybe it's like politics. We all have our opinions about politics, but we also, many of us have very strong opinions about economic matters, even though, curiously, many of us have not actually studied economics. So, if you ask a random person, do you have an opinion about whether the minimum wage should be raised, for example? Well, almost everybody has an opinion, sometimes a very strongly held opinion, but almost never have they reviewed the actual academic literature that has studied, and there is a huge literature about things like price ceilings, mandatory price ceilings and price floors. Or should we have tariffs on Chinese goods? People have opinions about these things, haven't really studied it. So that, I found that to be curious. And to be fair to people who don't study economics or who aren't interested in reading economics journals, if you were to open up a contemporary academic journal, economics academic journal, basically anywhere you dip into it anywhere, what are you going to see? You're going to see a lot of equations that require a lot of technical knowledge, even to make sense of, let alone to try to apply to your life. So it's very foreboding. I mean, it's very hard to get into that. And then, as you noted at the outset, Rachel, it's also the case that economists disagree about a lot of things. They get a lot of things wrong. They disagree about a lot of things. So I think, even Nobel laureates are on different sides of economics issues. So I think people can be forgiven for, maybe saying, well, why should we pay attention to those guys? They don't really know what they're talking about. And so this book, Seven Deadly Economic Sins, was written for people who do have an interest in understanding how economics might help inform decisions, either in their personal lives or in the public square. But also because I think although there are many things that economists disagree about, there are some fundamental principles that just about every economist agrees on. And these are fairly basic. And when you lay them out, I hope anyway, you have a look at the book. You can tell me whether you think I'm right or not, but they can be laid out in a fairly intuitive way. But in some cases, they have counterintuitive implications. So you understand some of the principles, but then when you start to apply them, you realize, some of the decisions I'm making or some of the considerations I'm bringing to bear when I'm making these decisions aren't really the right kinds, and I'm thinking about them not in quite the right way. So I think it's possible that at least some of the basic principles of economic reasoning can actually help us make better decisions in our own personal lives, and we're thinking about how to allocate our own personal scarce resources, limited resources, but also when we're evaluating policy at the state or the federal level. These basic principles, I think, they don't tell us always exactly what to do, but what they can do, I think, is clarify the implications of things. If we're going to do this, here's what we can expect. If we're going to do this, here's what we can expect. And, then you do still need, and this goes back to your earlier point about, sort of philosophy in economics, you do still need to have moral judgment, philosophical judgment. What trade-offs are worth making? What are the sometimes doing the right thing requires some actual sacrifice. Sometimes it doesn't. So if we know what sacrifices or what costs might be involved in various decisions, well, that puts us in a much better position to make a good and informed decision.
What's fascinating is that if you are going to say seven deadly economic sins, well, then there has to be a truth. There has to be a truth that's somehow fundamental or underlying what is factual. And I like how you brought up the idea that a lot of people have opinions, and we can talk about our opinions on minimum wage, we can talk about opinions on all of the decisions that politicians are making. But I think there's something really valuable about going back to the principle. You mentioned that word as well, principle, the principle of what's actually happening. And you need to have a level of rational thought about that, but also you have to be honest. I guess intellectually honest in order to truly arrive at a conclusion that works. And so you need to know what is truth in the world of economics, what is truth in the world of philosophy. And so that's the only way that you can label something a sin or a fallacy, is if there is a counter or an opposite to that, which is a truth. And so I like that you are bringing out this idea that there's way more than opinion. It's not just opinion about should we raise or lower interest rates? Should we raise or lower minimum wage? Should the government give more money to this or less money to that? Or should we spend more or less on certain wars? And I think we can often make financial decisions in our own life, but also judgments of political dealings in the way of just our opinion rather than coming back to the source. And I like that you're bringing it all the way back to the source.
Thank you. Yeah. It sounds like you have a question that you're going to ask now.
I am, but also Bruce.
Are you going to challenge me?
Bruce, did you have somewhere you wanted to go from there?
Well, I think I'd like to start out because I like the fact that wealth is a zero-sum game. It's kind of like the first thing that mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
And I like what you talked about is that where does that fallacy come from? Where people worry about that. And growing up in the 60s and 70s when we were, especially in the 70s when inflation was rampant and the economy was not very good. And then growing up in a lower economic class, a lot of those things I saw personally that just kind of oozed in not only to my family, but my community. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before. My father was, who I love dearly and still alive, but he was like, you don't talk about money ever. You don't talk about how much anything costs, how much anybody makes. And that's what really fascinated me. It's like, why? And I think now looking back and studying this, because he thought if he brought a car home that was really nice, he was getting judged by somebody else saying, well, the only reason you were able to afford that car was that because you took advantage of somebody else.
Yep.
And actually his main source of income was a Shell full service station where he would actually give away services to people all the time. And everybody, and he's the greatest person in the world. Everybody in the town thought he was the greatest person in the world, but it ultimately caused him to lose his business because he could not keep it open because he wasn't turning a profit. And so this is the greatest example of where a person is worried about, taking advantage of somebody else, but they're providing a great service and they're not getting compensated for the service. So if you could comment a little bit about the wealth as a zero-sum game, because this is something we talked with previous podcast guests very extensively. And I think you probably put it number one as for a reason.
Yep. And for just you're exactly right. And just for the reasons you suggest, I mean, one thing that your story about your father makes me think of is that one of the things people say about business is that, especially people who aren't in business, but who are criticizing business, they say that, oh, well, if you're going to succeed in business, the way you succeed in business is by being sort of ruthlessly selfish, that you're out for number one and only that means you and that's all you do. But for anybody who's actually been in business, actually tried to conduct, run a business, meet a payroll, deep in your bones that if the only person you're thinking about is yourself, you're going to go out of business in a New York minute. You have to be constantly thinking about everybody else, your employees, your customers, your community, your clients, potential
vendors.
I mean, you're thinking about everything. What's giving you gray hair at night and keeping you up at night is thinking about everybody else. You all often come way down at the bottom, even less. But you're right. I think that that does connect in an interesting way. It's a great story, and it's a story that there are many stories like that we never hear about. The stories about business that we hear and read about are about the big, large-scale bad actors. We don't hear about the millions of people who are engaging in mutually voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions that go on across the country and around the world all the time. We never hear about them. But that idea about wealth being a zero sum, that is it is number one, and that's the first chapter in my book, and for a reason. That's a very pervasive view. And I think many people sort of intuitively think that if any person succeeds, you succeed, you start a business, you're successful in your business, you become a billionaire. People often think, well, the only way you could possibly have done that is by doing something bad to somebody else. They might not know exactly what you did wrong, but they're pretty sure you must have done something wrong. And I think part of the explanation for that is that people tend to think, maybe it's a natural thing. And there are some researchers who think there's actually an evolutionary explanation for this. I'm not sure about that, but in any case, it does seem very intuitive, very natural to view the world in zero-sum terms. Meaning, if you think about our resources, all the resources we have are limited. In fact, the entire discipline of economics doesn't get off the ground unless you recognize and assume that fact that however much anybody has, we always want more. Our desires always outstrip the resources we have to meet them. And so that's not just natural resources. It can include natural resources. It can include our money or our own wealth. It can include things like our time. Our time is absolutely limited. And so if you think about our time, any time, any year, month, week, day, hour you spend doing one thing that is a period of time that is gone forever in the history of the universe. You do not ever get it back. It is gone. So if you spend it in one direction, that means it cannot be spent in any of the indefinitely many other things, ways that you might have spent it. And that's true also for our other resources. Any dollar you spend in one place is a dollar that cannot also go to some other place. And so what that suggests to people, that fact alone has a lot of interesting implications. But I think what a lot of people think about, assume because of that, is that the resources we have in the world, like our time, if you think about time, that's relatively fixed. There was a time when you came into the world, and there is a time, I'm sorry to say, when you will go out of the world. And however much time there is between those 2 points, you can't manufacture any more of it. That's all there is. And I think a lot of people think the same thing about wealth and prosperity, that there is a fixed amount of wealth or a fixed amount of prosperity, and that all we're really doing is sort of moving it around. And if you get a lot of it, that means that somebody else must have gotten a lot less. So I think a lot of people view the activity of wealth creation as, like a baseball game. If the Red Sox and the Yankees are playing, one of them's going to win and the other one has to lose. You can't both win. And so I think they transfer that to what goes on in wealth. What's interesting and really, to me, a spectacular discovery almost that human beings made relatively recently in our history, is that it's possible for both sides to win. If you think about human history, say before around 1800, longer ago in our past, think about the Egyptian pharaohs and the pyramids that they built. Well, it took a lot of capital to build those pyramids. Where did they get all of that capital? Well, conquest, slavery, theft. Okay. So they weren't really creating new prosperity. What were they doing? They were extracting it from other places and concentrating it right there in Egypt. And if you think about other great civilizations, think about the Roman Empire with the Colosseum and the aqueducts and the roads and the military. That also requires a lot of capital. Where did they get it? Same way. Conquest, slavery, theft. And that's true for almost every great and not so great civilization in human history that you can think of. Where did they get their resources? Usually by just taking it from others. But the interesting thing about that is that is zero sum. In other words, if I take something from you, suppose I want your iPad, let's say, or your iPhone. If I steal your iPhone from you, well, it's plus one iPhone for me, minus one iPhone for you, plus one plus minus one is zero. That's zero sum. In other words, there's no new wealth created. It's just taking it from one place and putting it in another. Well, what I mentioned a second ago about the great discovery we made was that there is another way for people to get what they want. So if you go back to the iPhone example, if you have an iPhone and I would like your iPhone, one way I could get it from you is by stealing it from you. That's zero sum. We're not creating anything new. But there's another way I could get it from you too. And the other way is I could make you an offer to buy it. I could make you an offer. And suppose I offer you some money and you agree and I agree. I give you the money and you give me the iPhone. Well, now who benefited? Both of us. And that's the shocking, surprising, and at the same time almost obvious conclusion, that both of us had to benefit from it. Otherwise, if you didn't think you benefited from it, you would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. If I didn't think I benefited, I would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. So those kinds of transactions, when they're mutually voluntary on both sides, they are mutually beneficial, so that you're not benefiting at my expense and I'm not benefiting at your expense. We're benefiting together. That's the key, the secret ingredient to increasing overall prosperity. The more mutually beneficial mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial transactions we have, the more overall benefit, the more overall prosperity that's created. And that's really what human beings discovered in around 1800 or so. And as that idea spread, that it was not a good idea to just steal from people, but instead to ask their permission to enter into voluntary agreements with people, voluntary exchanges, voluntary transactions. As that idea spread, more and more prosperity was created. And then, like the miracle of compounding interest, it just began to take off. And as that spread throughout the world, the overall, in real terms, the overall amount of wealth that the world has created is today more than it has ever been, and it is not close. And if you look at if you look at a graph of all of the wealth created on Earth through, we've tracked this. Economic historians have now been able to make pretty credible estimates going back at least about 12,000 years, so a long time. What does that graph look like? Well, let me see if I can show you. It's a whole lot of this, and then it's this. So in other words, it's a whole long, we have all, from 12,000 years ago to about 200 years ago, it's a very long, low line of almost nothing, people living more or less at subsistence. And then it just skyrockets up to levels today that have never been seen in the history of humanity. And that's true whether you're looking at real wealth, even per capita wealth. It is true in both cases. So the creation of wealth is itself, and this is the thesis of that chapter, it's positive sum. It's not zero sum. I don't benefit at your expense. We benefit together.
So to follow up on that, and obviously you're very skilled with your arguments, and sometimes I feel like I fumble through my questions or arguments, and so please bear with me. But you were talking about the iPad situation.
Yeah.
Well, then there's another argument that I hear people make all the time. Well, you're setting that price way too high. You need to bring that price down lower. So you're an evil person because you set the price way too high. So one of the things we do at the Money Advantage is we actually show people how to use specially designed life insurance contracts to actually store money into, and there's a variety of benefits to that. And one of the things that, and it came out of Nelson Nash, who was an Austrian economist, and he was always talking about, places to store money. And so, but where I'm going with all this is now it's actually exploded into the internet now. And the big argument about different designs is that, that agent's going to get paid more because they set the design like this.
Uh-huh.
Well, what I've always argued is the person that's selling the product does not set the price. The consumer sets the price, because it's the consumer's behavior that determines whether they're going to buy it or not. Nobody's forcing them to buy it. And this is a concept I think that is very difficult. I'm also a bourbon enthusiast, and I follow a lot of bourbon blog boards and Facebook groups, and they're always complaining about the bourbon on the secondary market, that this particular vendor is selling this bourbon at 5 times the retail price.
Yeah.
And they're evil people. And I'm like, no, they're not evil people. People are obviously buying it at that particular price. So the consumer is actually setting the price. So I'm just curious if my philosophy or thoughts on this are accurate, as far as your zero sum wealth game, or just some comments on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, those are some great examples. So maybe I would make 2 related points in connection with what you were with your example, especially like that bourbon example. I mean, there are many others like that where there are secondary markets and the prices on secondary markets are
concert tickets. Tickets.
Yes, right. Have you bought a Taylor Swift concert ticket recently, or attempted to? Yeah.
Right.
So I would make 2 points about that. One is, I think we should distinguish between what I would call, these are my terms, but what I would call an aspirational price and a real price. So we all have aspirational prices. So use an easy example. I want to sell my house. I would love to get $10 million for my house. That's my aspirational price. So would anybody actually pay that? No, of course not. But I would really love to get it. So I can say that is a price that I, as a supplier, would like to set. But it's an aspirational price. On the other hand, suppose you're a buyer who's potentially interested in my house, and you would really like to buy my house for $5,000. Well, that too is your aspirational price. That's what you would like to pay for it. So my aspirational price and your aspirational price obviously are pretty far apart. And if I stick to my price and you stick to your price, then we don't ever actually have a transaction. It just doesn't happen. You say no thanks, and I say no thanks. But what often happens in the real world is that, sure, we have these aspirational prices, and you can think about another term. How much money would you like to be paid? Everybody on earth would like to be paid more than they are being paid. So we all have aspirational prices in that sense as well. And you can even assume that employers also have their aspirational prices of they'd really like to pay you less. They'd really like for you to do the good job you're doing, but pay you less because they would like to save it too. So those are aspirational prices. Well, what's a real price? A real price emerges when the two parties say yes, when they agree on something. So if you and I negotiate and we come to a point where we both voluntarily, nobody's forcing or coercing the other person, but if we both voluntarily say yes to a price, that's now a real price. And what that means is, and there are plenty of assumptions built into this. One is that we're not coercing each other. Another one is that we're at least minimally rational people. We're adults. We're not, incapacitated in any particular way. But for the vast majority of normally functioning adults, if you say yes to a price, whether to buy something or to sell something, what that means is you're saying that that price you're agreeing to is gives you more benefit than you think you're giving up. Mm-hmm. So now I don't know how much more, but it's going to be more than zero, because otherwise you would have said no. You wouldn't have, if you thought you were benefit, that it was actually more cost to you than benefit, you would have said no. And I would do the same on my side. So the real prices that emerge are actual reflections of people's subjective sense of their value, given the other resources they have, the goals, aspirations, wishes, desires, preferences. In light of all of those things, they are reflections of what people actually value. And that's going to be, importantly, different for everybody. We all have different conceptions. So maybe you, Bruce, are willing to spend a lot more money on a fine bourbon than I am. And does that mean you're right and I'm wrong? No. What that means is that you have preferences that might be different from mine. So I'd rather spend my money, I don't know, on a first edition 18th century book. Okay. Does that mean I'm right and you're wrong? No, it just means we're different people, and that's okay. So there is a difference between aspirational prices and real prices. And then the other point I would make, especially in relation to things like bourbon. So I don't know much about that market, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but my guess is that the kinds of bourbon that people are talking about that are being sold on secondary markets are usually limited batch. In other words, it's not an unlimited quantity or supply of this. So suppose you have a small supply of any good or service, but it could be, we'll take bourbon, and you have more people who would like it than you have a supply to give to everybody. How do you figure out who should be the ones who get it? Well, what the prices do is they enable you to figure that out. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it tends to track with the strength of people's desires. If you, Bruce, really love a particular bourbon, then you're probably going to be willing to spend more for it than somebody else who maybe kind of likes it, wouldn't mind it, but it's not as high in their priority list as it is for you. So that will be reflected in the price that you're willing to pay as opposed to somebody else, which means that the supplier of that bourbon, the maker of that bourbon, is going to have figured out, oh, you're the person who should get it. They don't have to know anything else about you. Maybe they've never met you, don't know you from Adam. But the fact that you're willing to offer more must mean more to you. And if we have a scarce resource and a larger set of desires, then that's the best way, or that's a pretty good way to allocate to the most highly valued uses. So, it may be that people who complain, maybe you or, we might much rather have a particular good or a particular service at a much lower price. Sure, that's always true no matter what we're talking about. But in a world of scarcity where things are limited and we don't have unlimited supplies, then we do have to make these kinds of decisions, and we have to make these allocations. And what's a good, how do we do that? What's the best way to do that? Well, prices that emerge from what I'm calling these real prices, where people actually say yes to transactions, that's a pretty good indicator. And not perfect? No, it's not perfect. But I think we'd be hard pressed to come up with a better way to figure out who really values something more highly than another person.
Yeah, it's an example. I always talk about all the different isms, whether it's totalitarianism or capitalism or socialism. Capitalism is not without fault, but it tends to be the best ism. And we talked a little bit about Hayek, before the show, and one of the thoughts, and I think you actually even talk about it in your book, is creating economic equality. Hayek said requires creating political inequality, and that is a thing that what are you actually trying to accomplish? And a lot of our politics, even today, are trying to espouse the benefits of equality, but at what cost? Yeah. And so could you maybe, comment on those thoughts that you had in the book also about Hayek?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the initial fallacies, I don't know Rachel, if it quite rises to the level of an economic sin, but one of the fallacies that people often think is that when we talk about equality, there is only one kind of equality, and we can achieve that. But in fact, equality can be understood in many different ways: equality before the law, equality of opportunity, equality of wealth, equality of income. These are all very different kinds of things. And what's interesting about that is that if you champion any one of them, you pick one that is the one that you like, they will often come at the expense of the other ones. So you can't have all of them at the same time. And I think that's the Hayekian point, Bruce, that you were suggesting, is that suppose we want to have equality of, pick your favorite, but suppose we want to have equality of wealth, let's say. Everybody has the same amount of wealth. What's that going to mean? Well, that will mean that we're going to have political institutions that are going to restrain some people and encourage other people, maybe have some redistribution from one group to another group, which means that politically, we're treating different groups of people differently. So we've now given up on equality before the law. And that's one of the implications. So if you think that equality of wealth is more important than equality of the law, okay, but then you're going to have to make that case, and you have to realize that that's what you're giving up. We live in a limited world of scarcity. You can't have everything you want, so we're going to have to look at the trade-offs involved. So that's one important sort of philosophical point about equality. But I would also suggest that there are plenty of cases of inequality that are perfectly innocent. We have to beware of one of the 7 deadly moral sins. The 7 deadly sins is envy, and I think we have to be conscious of the fact that we are often extremely envious of other people. That's a 7 deadly sin for a reason. We are often extremely envious of others. And one quick example of that: my best friend from high school is a medical doctor. So he went on to become a board certified medical doctor. And I'm a professor. And for most of our respective careers, he's made at least 10 times as much as I have made. And, he likes to rib me with that. So, if we're just looking at wealth, certainly income, but also wealth, there's a great deal of inequality between him and me. Even though we had similar educational careers, but we just took different professional paths that led to different levels of wealth. So there's a great deal of inequality, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because I potentially could have become a medical doctor, but I love what I do, and so choosing what I did, that's a trade-off I was willing to make. Yes, I gave up more money, but what I get for it is I get to talk with people like you about great ideas and books. Now, that wouldn't have been the right trade-off for him. He'd rather do what he does, and that's okay. So the fact that people take different paths, that's actually can be a reflection of the fact that people are just different. And that's all right. People are naturally different. They naturally have different interests and abilities and desires. And if you have a free society, those differences among them are going to reflect different paths that they'll take in life. So the fact that they end up being not exactly the same on different margins doesn't by itself mean that anything is wrong with that. In fact, it could even be a cause for celebration, the spectacular diversity of humanity.
There's so much packed into that. I was going to bring up a point earlier, and I realized how close to the end of our time we are. So,
oh my gosh, it's moving. It's going so quickly.
I know. When we're in a good conversation, I always wish it could last much longer. So, there was something that you were mentioning earlier, and the whole idea of people feeling like wealth is zero sum. I think sometimes there's this sociological element that is really envy based. That is, well, if I see somebody that's made more than me, and I envy that first, then I want to be them. So I'm elevating them in status above myself. Well, I don't want to be in that position because now I'm demeaning myself and making myself feel less than. So I have to somehow right that scale and maybe say, well, maybe they achieve that through unethical means. And so therefore now I'm back in my, superior moral position. I think we go through these mental gymnastics a little bit to figure out the world. But I really almost wonder, and I don't know how this would play onto the exponential curve, but I wonder if so much of our humanity is almost hardwired to go towards how we consume and use resources rather than the creation of resources. I think it's a lower level intellectual task to figure out, how am I going to spend this money to subsist? How am I going to spend this money to enjoy my life? But then making the money, well, that seems like that's a whole nother, that's a whole different discipline that requires a lot more thought. And when you realize that wealth is created, it's not just used, then that allows us to be in that space of figuring out mutually beneficial transactions.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think on behalf of my fellow professors, that we should take the blame in part for that, because we spend a lot of time talking about the proper, maybe the morally proper distribution of resources. And we don't spend very much time thinking or talking about how to produce resources. And that's a real mistake, because wealth is not, it doesn't grow on trees. It doesn't magically appear. Every particle of wealth that we have has been created by human beings. It takes human action and human labor, human ingenuity to create, and it doesn't happen in any other way. And an interesting way to put that is, there was an economist who died a couple of decades ago, Julian Simon. Maybe you've heard of him, but Julian Simon used to say, there's no such thing as a natural resource, because in fact, there are no resources other than those created by human beings. And the way the example used to illustrate that was, he said, go back in your mind, historically in your mind, to say 5,000 years ago, or even 2,000 years ago. There was this black tar-like substance that was under the sands of many Middle Eastern areas. Was that a resource? No,
not
because
at the time,
it was just a nuisance. They didn't know what to do with it. But then somebody figured out something to do with it. And it didn't become a resource until we collectively human beings, figured out what to do with it. And that goes along, even that little example, I think, goes some way to helping people understand that we can't talk about how we should distribute resources or redistribute resources unless there's already some resources created. So we have to have something first before it can be distributed. You can't, divide the cake up among your children until you have a cake first, which means somebody had to have made that cake, which means somebody had to have gotten the ingredients for that cake, etc. So once you start backing that up, you realize that, wow, whatever we think about, if we take a snapshot look at society, anytime we did that, any of us might say, well, I don't like the way resources are distributed in my society. More should be over here and less there, et cetera. We might move things around if we could. But we also have to realize that that the fact that we might like to have the opportunity to have resources tomorrow also, and next week and next month, means we also have to think about, what are the institutions that incentivize production? What are the institutions that incentivize people to innovate, to create, to work, to labor, and maybe even to take joy in the fact that they're creating and laboring? And we don't want to have institutions or policies, regulations, programs that punish people for those things. Because if we're punishing people or imposing costs on those people, then we can endanger, then you really are slaying the goose that's laying the golden egg. You don't want to do that. So that, I think, really is an important thing for us to think about. And you're right, we don't spend enough time thinking about that as well.
And yet, I think entrepreneurship is a dream. It is a thing that is in the heart of so many people. And yet I think often we relegate it to, that's just a few people will be successful in business. But if you look at what made America, what brought most people wealth, it was being in business of some kind. So I know we don't have a lot of time left, but can you just take that thought and jump into a little bit about what you say about business can be moral and honorable?
Yeah. So I'll tell you one thing that does worry me about the future. I mean, there maybe are many things worth worrying about for the future. But as a professor who deals with college-age students, one thing that I think I have noticed is that in recent years, there's been a decrease in the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that students have. What they want to get a job with an already existing company. They're less interested in striking out on their own and finding some problem that they can solve on their own, or they can come up with some new way to think about how to address humanity's various different kinds of problems and difficulties. And that does worry me because if we think, well, we only need one or two entrepreneurs, we only need one Steve Jobs, and we only need one Elon Musk or whoever. That's not enough. I mean, everybody should think about themselves as being something like an entrepreneur. And so, to go to your question about honorable business, I mean, the first thing to say about what I consider to be honorable business is never to engage in the kind of extraction we talked about a little while ago, where I benefit myself at your expense. That has to be not be necessarily because there's a law against it or because somebody's watching or I might get punished, but just through sheer force of my character. I'm not the sort of person who would ever benefit myself at somebody else's unwilling expense. So that's sort of the baseline. But I think there's also a positive obligation, and the positive obligation is to say, look, even if you're not, so I'm a Catholic. I teach at a Catholic university, and we say things like, we're all created in the image and likeness of God, and God was a creator, and so part of what we are is also as creators. So it's part of our nature. But even if you don't believe that, you can still recognize that everybody has different gifts, as it were. Everybody has a different signature of talents, abilities. They're not all the same. They're unique. It's part of what makes us interestingly unique as human beings. But what that means is that there is some unique kind of value that only you can contribute to the world. That literally there is no other human being on earth in the history of humanity that some kind of value that could be contributed by you that nobody else could do. And so I think the positive aspect of honorable business is figure out what that is. Be entrepreneurial and innovative in your own life. How can I use the abilities I have, under the constraints that I face? I have obligations and I'm in a certain kind of society in a certain time, et cetera. Yeah, sure. There are all of those constraints, and maybe we all, would like to have been dealt a better card, by the gods or by God or something, better hand. But you have a hand, you should play it. And there is some kind of value that you can contribute to the world that nobody else can. And I think a kind of calling for an honorable business person is to say, I want to figure out how I can use my unique package of abilities to create value for other people, not just for myself. I mean, I can improve my own situation as well. That's fine, but only if at the same time I'm benefiting somebody else. And if you feel that calling and are willing to incorporate that into your professional life and into all aspects of your life, then that I think really is a definition of honorable business.
Yes, this reminds me back of so many conversations. I'll name a few. Rabbi Lapin shares that whole idea as well, that you have to be, the business and economic transactions are mutually beneficial, and you have to serve another person in order to get that benefit. So just super congruent. Exactly right. Bob Berg talks about the same thing with the go-giver, that you have to give in order to receive. It's like this breathing dichotomy that happens. Yeah. He wrote some fabulous books. And then I'm even thinking of John and Missy Butcher, who've talked about the beginning of money and what that even means to have money, and the creation of money is so valuable. So we are almost at our time, but would you share with us how people can find you, and then just a little bit about some of the work that you're doing with speaking as well?
Sure. So thank you very much. So there are multiple ways you can find me. If you go to the University of Notre Dame's website, there's a faculty profile of me there, and you can find me at the university's website. I also have my own website, which I should update more frequently than I do. I should be better about that than I am, but I have my own website, which is just my name, jamesaddison.com. Most of my books that I've written are all available on places like Amazon or Barnes and Noble. But one of the things, to your other question about sort of speaking, one of the things, so I get invited to speak in many different kinds of scenarios, to college students, sometimes to faculty, sometimes to groups of business people, sometimes religious groups. So if there's a Catholic entrepreneurs or Jewish entrepreneurs or Jewish business people, they might ask me to come and speak. But one of the things that I have discovered in giving talks to various kinds of audiences that dismays me a bit is how many people who are either interested to become business people, so maybe students who are studying business and want to be business people, or people who are in business now and in some cases very successful business people, how many of them are a little embarrassed by the fact that they're in business or studying business or successful in business. it's as if they're embarrassed by it, like they've done something wrong that they need to maybe atone for. And one of the things, if you just give me 30 seconds about this, one of the things I've noticed is that this is reflected in this common phrase people hear, that businesses or business people need to give back to society. So a lot of business people think, I need to give back. And my thought about that is that, well, I mean, did you steal it? You know, if you stole something, yeah, then you need to give it back. Or if you despoiled somebody else's property, okay, then you need to indemnify them. You need to make them whole. But if you're successful in business by engaging in mutually voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions and benefiting yourself only at the same time by benefiting other people, I don't think that's something you need to atone for. In fact, I think that's something you should be proud of. You figured out a way to use your unique gifts to benefit other people. That's something we should be proud of, and I think we should be celebrating.
Amen. That is absolutely true. It's so interesting how often that comes up, and that we hear that as well, and that there somehow feels this need to give or to do charity in a way to reconcile some kind of a wrong that's been made. To atone for your sin. Yes, which being in business is not a sin. And if you recognize the core value of providing value to others, and if you recognize that you have had to deliver tremendous value to start in business, to continue the next day in business, and to be in business for the next year and the next 5 years, it all requires tremendous giving and tremendous service and figuring out what people need enough and what problems they're aware of that they would like your help with. It requires you to become no, my goodness, I'm messing up all the words. Bigger and better. I made all the wrong words with that. Bigger and better person in order to be able to supply the value that they need. I think all around business is transformationally amazing.
Yeah, and it can even accomplish that against our own wishes. So you might be the most selfish person in the world in your heart of hearts, but you will not succeed in business unless you spend all day, every day, thinking about other people and how to solve other people's problems and make other people's lives better off.
Yes, this is profound. There are so many more things that I'd love to talk about, but we might have to save that conversation for another day. We'll have to have you back at some point if you would, oblige us. And this has been a profound and wonderful conversation. So in closing, please know that you can go find Jim. So we've called him Dr. Jim Otteson today. I'm going to spell his website just so that you have that. That's James, James, Otteson, OTTESON.com. So go ahead and find him, find his work. And if he could be of service to you and your group, your tribe, your audience in any way, please do reach out to him. This work needs to be heard by many more people.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I'd love to come back. So please feel free to invite me.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Bruce, is there anything that you wanted to share before I close?
I would just like to say that, when people are looking to create wealth, I think it's just not a passing phase. You actually have to do the work. You have to do the research. You have to commit to this. And, I find this is actually sliding in society, just like you're seeing sliding your students out of entrepreneurship. It's like, even with people that are saying, like with an Amazon, a business, now people are out there saying, you don't have to do anything. Just give me your money and I will create this business for you. And you can just sit back on the beach and collect all the money. And that is a prevailing, passive income. Yeah. And that's the prevailing thought. And we say, we have requirements to actually work with us, that you have to provide us information that makes you work. You have to read, you have to do this. But a lot of people in our society now are actually just expecting wealth to be handed to them. Yeah. And it really requires that. The reason it's valuable is because it requires work to get to that particular situation. And I'll just end with this: is if it was easy, everybody would do it, and then it wouldn't be valuable. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, that's right. We'd have all the wealth in the world, and nobody would have to do anything. Maybe that happens in heaven. But that's not on earth.
That is true. We work and we labor. And thankfully, we have the ability to work, and we've been given a gift of work, and we can value work because it is a good thing. So many great ideas we can unpack next time. So in closing, I do want to also invite you, if you've heard anything about our work, that we've had little snippets throughout today, specifically as Bruce was sharing, if you'd like to talk with our team about your financial life or about infinite banking, you can reach out to us and book a conversation at themoneyadvantage.com, and we'll have the links. We share that all the time, but I just want to make sure that you had that for this show. And in closing, thank you for listening today. Thank you for being part of our audience. And thank you, Dr. Otteson, for joining us for this great conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
In closing, remember, success leaves clues. So model the successful few, not the crowd, and build a life and business you love.